And now we have another docudrama by Netflix, Alexander, the Making of a God. Is it any good? No, not really. Of course not. But it could have been worse. So the miniseries follows the same blueprint of previous Netflix documentaries on ancient history, like this hilarious Roman Empire series, 3 seasons, which bluntly tells us that Gaius Caligula was in an incestuous relationship with his 3 sisters. And then we had Queen Cleopatra, which was an absolute disaster and can be watched only as a comedy. I have a video about Cleopatra on this channel, obviously. So, first things first. Even though we're dealing with a Netflix miniseries, they decided not to cast some African-American or Black British as Alexander. A big decision. And I regret this decision, because otherwise I could get more views for this video. And also, it is actually good for the historical studies and the perception of classical antiquity by the mass audience. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but when something as outrageous as the Queen Cleopatra miniseries happens, you have a public uproar and some people actually start reading sources or something serious on the subject. It didn't happen with Gladiator, though. I mean, no uproar, although this film is, well, as insulting as Queen Cleopatra. People just don't get it. Okay, what we have with Alexander the Making of a God is, well, the same Netflix docudrama formula, dramatization plus talking heads of the experts. But this time everything is diluted a bit by the footage of archeological excavations in Alexandria. Naturally, they don't have a budget to show you epic battles of Alexander. If you want that, then there is this Oliver Stone's movie from 2004. Big budget, epic battles, and epic everything. I mean, the extended cut is like 3.5 hours long. No, seriously, a 3.5 hour long version exists. They have like 10-minute dance sequences. At least it feels like a 10-minute sequence. The Making of a God is 6 episodes, roughly 40 minutes each, and it covers Alexander's reign up to the death of Darius III, which kind of implies that there's going to be a second season. Now, let's discuss some of the details. And I also want to talk about Arian a little bit. I think this is important and this is a very good occasion. Let's go. Characters. The main characters from the Macedonian side, apart from Alexander, are Hephaestion and Ptolemy, who are described as his closest childhood friends. Parmenion is featured quite a lot as well, but he's shown as the person who opposes Alexander all the time. Whatever Alexander does, Parmenion criticizes him. That's the key cast. They pretty much ignore the existence of important people like Clytus, Perdiccas, or Craterus. Well, they show Cletus for like 5 seconds. You can make a case that the dramatizations need certain simplifications, otherwise it is just very hard for the audience to follow what's going on and who are these people. You cannot just introduce like 20 characters. The viewers might get confused. That's true, but we're talking about a documentary. So erasing some of the important figures, essentially from history, is a bold choice. Also, it must be noted that Oliver Stone's Alexander did a much better job at introducing characters. And you could quite easily identify that, okay, this is Craterus, this is Clytus, this is Cassander, etc. And Oliver Stone's film has a running time of like 215 minutes for the extended version, while the original theatrical version was 175 minutes. Well, the Netflix series is around 240 minutes, but that includes intros and stuff like that, so the actual running time is comparable to Oliver Stone's film. And Oliver Stone manages to kind of cover the whole life of Alexander, while the Netflix series stops at the death of Darius. So no, the showrunners don't have an excuse of we tried not to overcrowd the script. You were just doing a lousy job, and that's it. Next, we have this bizarre idea of using diminutive forms of names. The three friends, Alexander, Hephaestion, and Ptolemy, routinely address each other as Alex, Heph, and Ptol. That's just ridiculous. I understand that they try to show, realistic human interactions and familiarity and stuff. But choosing this Anglo-American pattern for the shortened forms of names is weird. You cannot call Alexander simply Alex. That's weird. It's like calling him Xander, Sandro, Sasha, or Alejo. We don't know the ancient Greek diminutive form of the name, so just relax and do nothing. Or theoretically, you could go for the modern Greek version. In this case, the short for Alexandros would be Alekos. But just stay out of it. That's a better option. There's a couple of other important Macedonian characters we can see briefly, like Olympias and King Philip. And Philip actually has both of his eyes in place. The casting for all of these roles is questionable, although I don't plan to talk about it too much. It is worth noting that this version of Alexander has blonde hair, which is reasonable, although he is visibly dyed blonde. But yeah, I get the decision. The sources insist that Alexander has blonde hair because it is a traditional feature, basically. Achilles was blonde, Helen was blonde, so they follow the same route when describing Alexander. Because he is first and foremost a legendary character, and we're gonna talk about it a bit later. What was the appearance of the historical Alexander? It is hard to say. He was probably more Mediterranean in his complexion, and the famous mosaic actually depicts him in a more stereotypically Mediterranean way. Now, the Persians. We have Darius and a couple of his generals, and all of them have a crush with eyeliner, because a Persian without eyeliner is not really a Persian. And the army also likes to wear turbans because, Persians are supposed to wear turbans, which is obviously wildly inaccurate. Here I'd like to talk mostly about Statira, the wife of Darius, because all of a sudden she's a very prominent character in the miniseries. The screenwriters are overplaying her role, mostly because, it is Netflix, you need strong female characters, which she probably was, but, there's too much Statira. She wasn't that important to Alexander's story. She's mostly a character from this anecdote that Alexander captured her, her daughters, and the mother of Darius after the Battle of Issos, which enabled him to show fantastic magnanimity, treat all of them as royalty, don't harm them, etc. That's it, more or less. But here, Statira is basically in every episode, and Alexander actually sleeps with her, and she gets pregnant. Which is one hell of a speculation for a documentary. So the speculation in the miniseries goes like this. Statira was separated from Darius for 2 years, since the Battle of Issos. So Darius couldn't be the child's father. So it is reasonable to speculate that Alexander was the father. There's a number of problems with the statement, including the timeline of the events. We don't know if Statira actually died in childbirth, and we don't know when it happened. Plutarch thinks that she indeed died in childbirth, but it wasn't 2 years or something, it was probably much less. And Quintus Curtius Rufus thinks she died because of illness. So yeah, that's an interesting theory, which is based on a sequence of assumptions that, first of all, Alexander slept with Statira. Sources actually directly contradict this, but you can say that, well, what do they know? Because they kind of don't. Second, that she was pregnant and died in childbirth. Sources cannot agree on that. And third, that she died more than 9 months after her capture at the Battle of Issos, which is, well, we don't know. It is a tiny and not very important character for whom we don't have enough data. Now, there are daughters of Statira, but since they don't want to overcrowd the screen, usually only one is shown, Statira number 2. And she should be much younger. Okay, now let's move to the important subject of the divinity of Alexander. I mean, important for the review and analysis. Outside of that, this is a non-subject. But the series is called Alexander, the Making of a God. Alexander as a god. Yeah, it's relatively amusing, and you can have these nice conversations about the divinity of Alexander. And did he actually believe that he was a son of Zeus, Ammon, or whatever? Or maybe he was on the fence on this subject. But when the Egyptian priests declared him an actual god, it reinforced his megalomania and so on. You can say a number of things about that, and I understand why they use this idea in TV series, even though it is marketed as a documentary. It is a nice, dramatic subject. The problem with these conversations is that they are inherently quite stupid. Plutarch believed that Alexander used the idea that he's some kind of a god or a demigod for practical purposes, just creating a cult of personality. And Arrian had the same opinion, although he discussed it at a slightly greater length. But yeah, the same idea. It was just political PR, nice propaganda for the general population. His fellow Macedonians obviously were not crazy about these developments, but you can easily understand Alexander if you treat him as a human and as a king of essentially a newborn empire. They were also not crazy about Alexander adopting certain Persian customs and gradually becoming more and more Eastern. But what do you expect? That was his way of dealing with the situation. You have a multi-ethnic state, and it makes sense to integrate people, or more correctly, the elites who actually make decisions that matter. Alexander was a general and a politician. We can treat him as a legendary or even mythological hero. This approach makes sense. But if we venture too much into these territories, we're in the territories of fairy tales. So then just let's stop pretending and start dissecting everything as a myth. But if we talk about Alexander as if he was a historical king, and that's exactly what we do, and in fact we're doing it right now, then let's be serious about this. He's a politician. He rules the country. Arrian and Plutarch understood that in the 2nd century. The experts on the TV show kind of understand that as well. They mention the political aspect, but the showrunners keep doing their thing, and it looks stupid. But then again, some talking heads on the show say things like, and I quote, Alexander saw himself as semi-divine. Well, yeah. Maybe. That's just highly debatable, and you probably should be very cautious when explaining actions of politicians operating with the idea that they see themselves as semi-divine, divine prophets, or they are insane. That's another popular trope. I'm usually quite surprised when I see people who are professional historians and hold actual positions at universities, teach students, etc. And they are discussing complex subjects like they are well-read teenagers or something. There's an explanation why this happens, and yes, some of the scholars are not actual scholars, but career scholars, if that makes sense. They're officiaries, functionaries, or just clerks. It is not really an attack on the particular expert on the show. This passage could be taken out of context by the editor, but that's an observation. Although I believe the same person tries to explain gods and heroes for the mass audience, and that's just hilarious. Here's the quote. For the Greeks, there were gods and there were demigods. And a god was someone who was a being who were completely divine. And they had been there at the creation of the world. Well, that's simply not accurate. It's just basic stuff. Why they left this passage in the final cut is beyond me. Gods were not there at this creation of the world event, although you can think of a couple of exceptions. But generally, no. The main thing here is that gods are immortal. They never die. They can't be killed. This is what's important. And this is where you have an opportunity to reference Plutarch. Because according to Plutarch, when talking to the Hellenic people, Alexander downplayed this divine aspect and mentioned that he has blood in his veins instead of ichor, because gods have ichor for blood. Let's stay on the subject of Plutarch. Let's talk about sources, and let's talk about Arrian. Sources and legends. Alexander is in many ways a legendary figure. I mean, we don't really have primary sources on Alexander to speak of. All of the accounts of his reign and expeditions, his biographies, everything that was written by people who lived roughly at the same time as Alexander, everything is lost. All we have is second-hand accounts of people who lived much later. The most influential sources here are probably Arrian and Plutarch, but we also have a couple of others like Diodorus Siculus, that's the earliest account actually, or Quintus Curtius Rufus. Obviously, the historical Alexander is most probably seriously distorted in all of these works, although they tell roughly the same story. The most respectable source on Alexander is probably the Anabasis of Alexander written by Arrian in the 2nd century AD. Let's talk about Arrian, because in a way, it reveals what we're actually dealing with. This is the right time to talk about him. Arrian, let's go. So the problem of Arrian and Anabasis of Alexander is that the author was doing some extremely interesting things during his lifetime, which possibly could include, let's call it, literary mystifications. Which might lead us to some interesting revisionistic and possibly even conspirological ideas. In short, Arrian was a huge fan of Xenophon and tried to imitate his style. He saw himself as a new Xenophon of sorts. So when we're talking about Anabasis of Alexander, the campaigns of Alexander, we immediately have to remember, and that was the whole point, another Anabasis, the work of Xenophon, also known as the March of the 10,000 in English. And here we have an interesting thing. The Anabasis of Xenophon tells the story of Greek mercenaries trying to escape Persia. And sometimes you can hear this opinion that this book directly inspired Alexander, or his father, to start a campaign against Persia something like 70 years after the events of Anabasis. Because Xenophon's story, in a way, describes that Persia was kind of a paper tiger. It had systemic problems that allowed this mercenary army to actually roam around the country, cover huge distances, and then just go home. So if Xenophon's mercenaries could do this, then a strong Macedonian army had a realistic shot at dismantling the whole of Persia. Even though it has been a really long time, I mean, 70, 75 years. But it's not like Persians were developing drones or nuclear bombs. Xenophon's Anabasis is actually mentioned in Arrian's work. He says that they used occasionally it as a tour guide of sorts, as a Lonely Planet book. So now we have this Anabasis of Xenophon, then we have a new Anabasis of new Xenophon, who tries hard to make it look like it was written by the same person. That's all very interesting, but Arrian didn't stop there. He also emulated Xenophon in the field of philosophy. Both Xenophon and Plato used Socrates as a literary character, basically inventing him. We don't know how much of the historical Socrates is in this fictional Socrates of Plato and Xenophon. Probably not much. So it seems that Arrian decided to create a new Socrates, Socrates 2.0, a fantastic man of wisdom, smart, virtuous, full of deep knowledge. You're gonna love him. And then he created Epictetus, a slave, a cripple, poor as a beggar, and the friend of God. Arrian obviously couldn't rival Plato's Socrates and the whole body of work of Plato, because nobody could. Plato is the ancient god of philosophy and the single most important philosopher in history. But Epictetus was different. He was mostly concerned about ethics, and he was telling you how to live your life. Of course, Arrian said that he was a student of Epictetus and he just published his notes from numerous lectures. But we don't know how much of this notes can be credited to historical Epictetus and how much to Arrian, his pupil, if he was his pupil, if historical Epictetus actually existed. He probably did, but Socrates also probably existed. This is an important aspect of Arrian and obviously his book on Alexander. Chances are we're dealing not only with a historian who was a fanboy of Xenophon, we're dealing quite possibly with one of the biggest philosophers of his time. Sorry for digressing. It was a long detour, but it kind of helps us to understand what we're dealing with. It shows us the actual context. The most prominent work on Alexander the Great is this, written centuries after the events, based on sources that don't exist, written by a world-class intellectual, for reasons which are not always entirely clear. Although he says that he wants to be essentially what Homer was for Achilles. He wants to spread the word about Alexander. Okay, let's move on. Narrator. I actually think that a good idea for the biographical film about Alexander is to use someone like Arrian as a narrator. I mean, something like that has been done by Oliver Stone, where he uses Ptolemy as a narrator. And Ptolemy actually wrote a book about Alexander and his conquests, but it is obviously lost. It is a good method. But if you use, as I said, Arrian, you can present the story as the work of a historian who lived many centuries after Alexander. He is relatively unreliable, and he actually knows that. Because one of the key features of Arrian is that he actively mentions his sources, like Aristobulus and Ptolemy. Sometimes he gives two contradicting accounts of certain events, and he genuinely tries to understand which version is more believable. If Arrian is your narrator, it is not only interesting, honest, and in a way historically accurate. I mean, Arrian actually wrote a book, but it is also a fantastic cheat code. All of the possible contradictions, inconsistencies of the narrative, illogical and straight-up legendary or even mythological stuff can be attributed to a version of a story which was given to us by a person who was also trying to figure out what was actually happening. Is it appropriate for the format of a documentary? That's an interesting question, and one of the main reasons why I am discussing this right now is because I'm actually proposing a much better alternative to what the screenwriters of Alexander the Making of a God are doing, because this TV show is narrated by some priestess at the Siwa oasis, which is not a great choice. And it's one of the vehicles that the screenwriters use to emphasize this divine and mythological aspect of Alexander. The narrator, the priestess, actually tells him that Alexander is in fact a son of Ammon or Zeus. It's good that the experts mentioned that the Greeks thought that gods go by different names in different places. Well, yeah. The narrator also says a number of dramatic things intended for, for children or something. Like that Alexander and Darius are the two sides of the same coin. And then we have visions in the Siwa oasis, and back in Macedon, where Olympias gives Alexander a special drink, and the talking heads say that ancient Greeks used hallucinogens in their religious practices. Which is not untrue, but be careful with that. I mean, yeah, there's this story about the oracle in Delphi who was breathing gas or something. Archaeologists actually insist that this is not fiction. They uncovered something during the excavations. And there are speculations that priests used something during the initiations to the mysteries at Eleusis. And there's a cult of Dionysus. But be careful, be reasonable, especially when you actually proceed to show Alexander's drug trips in a documentary. Then there's this story of Alexander being a potential demigod, which we discussed before, and this topic of him emulating Achilles, which is an interesting subject indeed. Honor and glory. So the showrunners discuss this Achilles and Alexander thing, which is good, but it depends how you discuss it. They show the pilgrimage of Alexander to the shrine of Achilles, and he uses what appears to be a shield of Achilles, which is weird. It's an artifact from the Iliad. Characters quote Homer once in a while, which is reasonable. And yes, there are these anecdotes in the sources that Alexander was a huge fan of Homer, because everybody was. But he also had some version of the Iliad with him at all times and practically kept it under the pillow. They probably used a very small font or something. I mean, the Iliad was like 24 scrolls in the library of Alexandria. How do you put this under your pillow? The thing is, as discussed earlier, Alexander is partially a legendary and even mythological figure. And it is more or less a trope of his biographers. Alexander also is a descendant of Achilles through his mother. She's from Epirus. And a descendant of Heracles because of his Argive ancestry. Just to be clear, both Achilles and Heracles are characters from mythology, not real people. And I used present tense when talking about Alexander's ancestry, like he's a mythological character himself. At least this aspect of Alexander. So Alexander is like an ancient Greek hero. He's all about honor and glory, meaning Time and Kleos. Which are not exactly honor and glory. These concepts had a slightly different meaning in ancient Greek, but I digress again. Alexander was essentially in the contest with Achilles, or at least that's how he's presented to us. Ancient epic hero from the works of Homer and possibly a demigod, who, let's be honest, kind of eclipsed Achilles, especially since Achilles is a fictional character and Alexander is, well, not entirely. Now let's proceed to something really interesting, something that will produce insults in the comment section. It always does. We need to talk about Macedonians. Macedonians and nationalism. Here's what they do in the TV show. Someone mentions that there are Greek mercenaries in the Persian army, and Alexander goes, "Treacherous rats." Really? I remind you that his father Philip kind of conquered most of Greece, and Alexander razed to the ground the city of Thebes like yesterday, which they don't show in the miniseries. And most of the Greek world was kind of allied to Persia during the Persian wars of the past. And Macedon was allied to Persia as well. It was essentially a Persian vassal. And then they continue, and you hear phrases like, "There were Greeks within their ranks. Greeks killing Greeks." What a surprise. Then one of the professors mentions the super famous joke that there were more Greeks in the Persian army than in Alexander's army, which cancels the dramatization we've seen only a minute ago. Who's the editor? Then they continue with more of this stupidity, and you see how Alexander is talking to the captive Greeks and then executes them. I mean, they probably shot the whole thing before they asked the talking heads to do the talk, and just didn't want to throw away the material that cost them money. So now this documentary contradicts itself. Let's talk about traitorous rats. Who were Macedonians? That's a dangerous question, because Greek ultranationalists will find you and start posting offensive comments, gradually copy and pasting quotes from ancient texts, starting with Herodotus, and then, let's be honest, there's going to be a lot of Aryans, since we're talking about Alexander. Here's the thing. Modern Greeks are locked in a number of petty squabbles with their neighbors, just like everybody, but Greek squabbles have a certain distinct taste to them. One of the biggest enemies of modern Greek ultranationalism is a tiny state currently known as North Macedonia, which appeared on the map like yesterday. It used to be a part of Yugoslavia before, and it has a population of 5 people. As a new state, it is relatively aggressively engaged in nation building, But unlike many other states in a comparable situation, they not only invent stuff out of thin air, as you do, but they try to appropriate elements of history and culture of everybody around them and forge a rather bizarre national history and identity. I mean, yeah, everybody does that too, but North Macedonia is a bit late, like 2 centuries late. And the government officials sometimes just turn this stuff into a full-blown theater of absurdity. So Greeks are very sensitive about the concept of a nation and about the origins of ancient Macedonians and modern Macedonians and Slavo-Macedonians. Everything that refers to Macedonia. They probably expect that the government in Skopje will start making territorial claims at some point. Theoretically, they can, but right now they're quite harmless, except for a couple of people who are prepared to start pointless debates on the internet and advance the idea that Greeks are not Greek enough, or something like that. I have a video on my second channel which jokingly tries to address the complexity of national identity, especially when you travel into the past with the 19th century concept of a nation. And Alexander the Great is the subject of this video. Was he a Greek? What kind of Greek? Were ancient Macedonians considered Greeks? When and why? As you might expect, I received comments that the Greek language hasn't changed for the last 4,000 years and genetically modern Greeks are in fact 70% Mycenaeans. So yeah, ancient Macedonians is a controversial subject and a complex one. To put things simply, Macedonians to Greeks were something like Scottish people are to English people. That's not a perfect analogy naturally, but it explains a couple of things. Macedonians were Highlanders. They were quite Hellenized. They spoke some local Doric dialect and had an interesting reputation. Ancient authors could include or exclude them into the Greek bracket depending on the author, the mood, and the political situation. Sometimes the same author can contradict himself on the subject, like Herodotus. Basically, up to a certain point, they were mostly perceived as some Hellenized barbarians who cannot even participate in the Olympic Games, only on a case-to-case basis, if they can prove Greek ancestry. But that kind of changed over time. And apparently Macedonian rulers wanted to integrate Macedonians as one of the types of the Hellenes, which is more or less normal. Alexander and his father were rulers of Greece, most of Greece. What do you expect? A Scottish king of both Scotland and England will try to unify the United Kingdom in one way or another. Not the best analogy again, but you get the point. It is better to be an integral part of the Greek world and Greek culture when you rule Greeks and you don't really have your own distinct independent culture. But the actual background of Macedonians is hillbillies, divided into mountain clans who are constantly fighting each other, and then they all get drunk and fight each other some more. We have an interesting situation when Alexander the Great did a lot to spread Greek culture around the world, but his homeland was not exactly Greece. This joke that the Persian army had more Greeks in their ranks than the Macedonian army is funny because it's true. I know that modern Greeks like to copy and paste letters of Alexander, from which it can be understood that he identified as a Greek, kind of. And as I said before, in a way it is true, but also these are not authentic letters and they are copied from Arian, who lived many centuries after the fact. Also, you can easily find interesting quotes from Arian which imply something different. For example, in the chapter about the Battle of Issus, he says that the fight was embittered by the old racial rivalry of Greek and Macedonian. Racial rivalry. So yeah, Macedonians were not exactly Greeks, but for sure they were Macedonians. I mean ancient Macedonians. Homosexuality. While Oliver Stone's Alexander heavily implies that Alexander and Hephaestion were lovers, the Netflix miniseries is more straightforward. It shows how they're kissing each other and say that Hephaestion was probably the greatest love of Alexander. Naturally, screenwriters never mention that all these ideas about Alexander and Hephaestion are mostly a product of modern historians who want to increase their social credit. All of this is not rooted in any of the sources, and if you're making a documentary, you absolutely must tell the audience that this is just a speculation. Most probably it came to life because sources like to mention that Alexander and Hephaestion were like Achilles and Patroclus. And this is the moment when unscrupulous historians go like, aha, bingo, they slept with each other. But this idea that Achilles and Patroclus were more than just close friends emerged much later. I mean, nothing like that is implied in the Iliad. And actually, Patroclus was older than Achilles, which theoretically means that Achilles, his king, was supposed to be on the receiving end. Just forget about it. Theoretically, this Alexander/Hephaestion pairing kind of makes some sense, especially given that ancient Greek culture tolerated this kind of activities. And quite realistically, Alexander could be what we call now bisexual. But that's a speculation. And since this speculation is not based on any source or any evidence, it doesn't really belong in a documentary. And there's no need to emphasize this aspect and blow it out of proportion.
Okay, Paul, in this round, I'm going to ask you to picture two men having sex.
Done.
Let me finish.
Netflix obviously has a different opinion because it is politics and large players in the movie industry have to conform with their dominant ideology, even if, on paper, this approach harms your business. In fact, it doesn't. Your company may lose money, but if you don't conform with the designated system of thoughts and refuse to promote it, you're gonna lose your job. All of these stories that Disney is killing its franchises by promoting something that's repulsive to the audience, or that Netflix is all about black and gay people, and all these studio executives are stupid and incompetent people, well, usually they're not. They have to do their job in the established framework. You don't really have much choice. I mean, if you're a senior manager in the Soviet film industry, you cannot criticize socialism, question the credibility of the Marxist-Leninist idea or something like that. You must promote all of this, otherwise you'll be fired or worse. Actually, saying out loud that communism is not the best system in history could easily get you institutionalized, because you're just disputing the scientific fact. You are insane. But people somehow think that American or British industries operate differently. They don't. They are slightly less oppressive, but it is more or less the same thing at this point. Back to our TV show. What is funny about this homosexuality, which is, by the way, not entirely an appropriate term when we're discussing antiquity. So what is funny and at the same time sad is they're actually trying to show homosexuality only in the positive context. The story of Alexander also includes an interesting episode with Pausanias, which they deliberately try not to mention. Pausanias is the guy who killed Philip, Alexander's father. And they show the assassination of Philip in the miniseries, obviously. And it is implied that Olympias most probably orchestrated all of this. But they don't say a word why it was easy to recruit Pausanias for this task. And it was because of the incident when he was raped by the servants of Attalus. And Philip did nothing about it. Battles and warfare. One more thing we need to address here is the depiction of ancient warfare in the TV series. Honestly, I didn't expect too much in this department, and many of the problems can be justified. As I've said in the beginning, you can't expect anything epic. They just don't have a budget for that. We're dealing with a quasi-documentary. If you want large-scale battles, go and watch Oliver Stone's Alexander. The problem with battles is not the scale of the thing, or that it all looks kind of cheap. I'm okay with that. They're just wildly inaccurate. There's no need to show gazillion soldiers on the battlefield, especially since all of the numbers mentioned in ancient texts are hugely inflated. I mean, if I remember correctly, Arrian says that there were like 1 million of Persian infantry at Gaugamela, which is ridiculous. But come on, make it more or less authentic with all 10 actors you have at hand. Why are we watching a street fight of Persians wearing turbans attacking Macedonians with short spears? This is not even a phalanx. And you absolutely must talk about the Macedonian phalanx in a documentary, which made the conquest of Greece and later the rapid expansion of Macedon under Alexander a reality. They don't do that. They also ignore some of the important battles and campaigns of Alexander, which slightly distorts a picture. Indeed, even Oliver Stone, with all his budget, and also had the problem of what we ignore and what we don't. For example, he compressed the events of different battles into one, the Battle of Gaugamela. The Battle of Gaugamela in the movie kind of merges the Battle of Issus and, well, the Battle of Gaugamela. But Oliver Stone's Alexander was never marketed as a documentary. Here, with all the talking heads of the experts and with all the tools of a documentary, at least you can go and discuss stuff. Sometimes you don't even need to show it. It is a good thing that, unlike Oliver Stone, they actually pay attention to Alexander's journey to Egypt. But they ignore things that the Macedonian army had done on their way to Egypt, and important battles like the siege of Tyre, of Gaza. And in the first episode, they show how Alexander came to power, but they show the execution of Attalus, and then they immediately switch to invasion of Persia. They just say that Alexander defeated all the rebellion in Greece, and that's it. I mean, if you're discussing tyrannical features of Alexander in the miniseries, and they do, which is kind of stupid, you should probably show or mention the destruction of Thebes, which was a very important event, almost unprecedented in the Greek world. Alexander just razed the city to the ground and sold almost everyone to slavery. That essentially was the beginning of his career as a king, and it tells you something about this man. Conclusion. Okay, this is a long video. Let's wrap this all up. Alexander, the Making of a God, is not nearly as atrocious as Queen Cleopatra, but still it is quite bad. It's boring, it is quite stupid, it wastes a lot of screen time on irrelevant things, hallucinations and mumbo-jumbo, pointless discussions about divinity of Alexander and stuff like that. The screenplay contradicts itself and once in a while just makes stuff up, like with these wild stories about Statira, Alexander and Hephaestion cuddling, etc. The costumes are sometimes quite inaccurate, which culminates with the depiction of the Macedonian army, which doesn't even feature a phalanx, and Alexander, for some reason, wears some kind of a battle version of the crown of Egypt during the Battle of Gaugamela, which is kind of hilarious. Casting and acting most of the time are quite questionable, but you can live with it because it is first and foremost a documentary. At least it is supposed to be a documentary. I guess that's it for today. If you're interested in the interconnected videos I mentioned here and there, please check the links in the description. I have videos on Alexander as a Greek, on homosexuality in ancient Greece and Rome, ancient pseudo-nations, etc. Thank you for watching, don't forget to subscribe, and see you soon.